Hi, everybody. Welcome to the third lecture of my course, ES 369N, Sustainability Issues and Energy. In this lecture, we're going to define what exactly it is we mean by sustainable energy. I'd like to remind all of you that if you've been enjoying these lectures, you can subscribe to my channel and get updates whenever I post a new video. And don't forget to hit the like button if you've enjoyed this content. So what is sustainable energy? Well, there's a couple of ways you can define it that are kind of similar. In the Tester et al. Book that I mentioned was recommended reading for this unit, they define it as a dynamic harmony between the equitable availability of energy-intensive goods and services to all people and the preservation of the earth for future generations. So that's basically giving people the things they need without messing up the ability of future generations to have a well-preserved earth. And in fact, Brundtland puts it a little more concisely, which is that sustainable energy meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So this is what we really want to think about. This is a good framework for thinking about sustainable energy. Now, I want to introduce you to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of these that have been approved by the United Nations. And, you know, based on what I've said in the previous two lectures, I hope you realize that every one of these 17 goals has a portion that can be covered by sustainable energy. So everything from reducing poverty and hunger to promoting good health and well-being and quality education, gender equality, clean water, affordable and clean energy, that's an obvious one. Work and economic growth, infrastructure, industry innovation, reduced inequality, sustainable cities, and so on and so forth. In fact, the IPECA, which is the Global Oil and Gas Industry Association for Environmental and Social Issues, has a very nice publication. It's called Mapping the Oil and Gas Industry to the Sustainable Development Goals, an atlas. And if you're more interested in this sort of thing, I highly recommend you check out the atlas. It's a very informative text. It's about 5 years old at this point, but still highly relevant. And there's a lot of good information in there. This is just a snapshot here showing some of the ways that the energy industry and sustainable energy in general can help contribute to the sustainable development goals. So some of these are more obvious than others. Obviously, water use is a big issue, both for oil and gas and for renewables. But then there's things like, reducing inequality. I talked in our last lecture about the degree to which, oil and gas wells in California tend to be located in areas with, typically more minority population and higher amounts of poverty. So maybe there are ways we can take care of that. Climate action is obvious. Life on land, life below water, obviously that's environmental conservation. But there are things all through these 17 sustainable development goals that the oil and gas industry and the energy industry in general can be part of. And I don't want you to feel like I'm just picking on the oil and gas industry. This is what the IPECA Atlas covers. But you can really think of this as the energy industry in general, based on our discussion of some of the environmental and social issues surrounding the extraction of critical minerals, for instance. So how can energy be made more sustainable if that's what we want to do? And I think it's pretty obvious that that is what we want to do. Well, there's really two ways you can do it. You can either make and use less of it, or you can make and use it the same way you're doing, but in better, more responsible ways. So in the former category, we have changes in lifestyle and increases in efficiency of various end uses of energy. I'm not really going to talk so much about these in this class. One of the questions that often comes up in this, especially with this changes in lifestyle, is it really ethical for us to tell developing countries that don't have access to a lot of energy resources? So think back to those graphs that I showed of average life expectancy. People in South Sudan presumably would like to, live longer, healthier lives, and increasing energy consumption probably is going to be part of that. So, is it right for us here in, the global north to tell these developing countries that they're not allowed to do it the way we did, just through increasing energy use? Ideally, we should be able to do this in a sustainable way, but this is a tricky question. And the other possibility here is to generate energy and use it in better ways. And so what I like to think about this involves sources of energy that have low waste. And what I mean by low waste is fewer emissions, fewer mine tailings, fewer evaporation ponds, just doing this in a less wasteful way. And then similarly, lowering the waste of existing energy sources. So, a good way of doing this is some of the discussion you've seen recently around net zero carbon emissions. So, we can still use, gas to generate electricity, but we need to offset the carbon emissions with something like carbon sequestration or something like that. In general, decarbonizing the energy sector. So in our unit where we talk about, gas transport and methane emissions, reducing methane emissions is a great way of decarbonizing the natural gas supply chain. So there's a lot of things we can do. And really the focus of this course, being an engineering sciences class, we are really going to focus on engineering solutions to address use and generation of energy in more sustainable ways. So if you're interested in some of the other aspects of this, I'd be happy to point you in some directions for some more materials that might address those. Okay, now what do I mean by energy? I hope I've defined sustainable in a fairly coherent way, but what do I mean by energy? Well, energy is going to be any source that produces things that we use. And so in this diagram, we've got energy sources, energy forms, and other energy sources. So basically, to do things in our lives, we require heat or mechanical work or electricity or some form of those. And so anything that can generate those three things is going to be an energy source. And so this includes everything from fossil fuels to solar and wind, geothermal. There's a lot of different sources on Earth of energy that can be used to generate heat, work, and electricity. And it's this whole diagram that we're going to be looking at making more sustainable. Now, here's the challenge about, especially with what I mentioned earlier about low waste energy sources. So the Energy Information Administration publishes an International Energy Outlook every year. And here's some information from their most recent International Energy Outlook published last fall in fall of 2021. So what they're looking at is what they expect the global energy consumption mix to look like out until the year 2050. So this plot on the left, this is, they're calling it primary energy consumption by energy source. So, what different sectors and populations are going to be getting their energy primarily from which source. So the colors on this diagram correspond to the same colors over here. So in general, what you can see is, with the exception of nuclear, all energy sources are going to have increasing consumption moving forward. So the y-axis here is BTUs. And for those of you who like metric units, 1 BTU is roughly 1,055 joules. And so you can see that in general, global energy consumption is forecast to rise through the year 2050. So think about, increasing quality of life, increasing GDPs, that sort of thing. That's probably good. If we're using more energy, people's quality of life is probably going to be increasing. So that's a good thing. But what I really want to draw your attention to is the relative trajectories of these lines. So coal is going to be increasing a little bit, not too much from where it is today. Natural gas is projected to rise more, and oil is projected to rise more, roughly the same rate as natural gas. But check out renewables. renewables are going to account for a lot more of global energy consumption by the year 2050, according to this forecast, than they do now. In fact, they are going to be second only to petroleum and other liquids in terms of an energy source by this forecast. Now, if we look in terms of percent of total energy consumption rather than raw numbers, you can see again that when we go from the year 2020 to the year 2050, renewables are the main category here that increases. And it's really mostly at the expense of coal, a little bit at the expense of natural gas. But the key takeaway I want to drive home here is that A, we are going to see increasing demand for renewable energy. So we have to remember that. And, if our overall goal is to meet global energy needs, well, if that's where the demand is going to be, we need to be able to meet that need. So we need to really scale up our renewable energy generation. But check this out. Coal, petroleum, natural gas, and other petroleum liquids, those are still going to make up a tremendous amount of global energy consumption, something like 70%. So it's not like our demand for fossil fuels is suddenly going to go away. It's still going to be there. And so, we need to figure out a way to try to offset some of the carbon emissions and other waste that come out of producing and consuming these fuel sources. And so there's a lot of cool things coming down the pipe, no pun intended, that we can do to make this work. Now, I want to close this lecture with a little bit of discussion about what the complexities are here and some of the nuances in terms of what we're dealing with, and why the energy transition is going to be so complicated. There was a nice article in The Atlantic in November of 2021 by Daniel Jurgen, which had this title. And it really gets at some of the interconnectedness in different industrial sectors and how difficult it might be to transition to different fuel sources. So one of the anecdotes that's told in the course of this article is a controversy that occurred between the North Face, which is a clothing company, and an oil field service company based in Houston called Innovex. Okay, so I want to start out just by introducing the North Face. Many of you are probably aware of this or aware of this company, but they pride themselves in making outdoor apparel and having a very sustainability focused corporate mindset. So if you go on their website, they have a bunch of different sustainability goals. A couple that I picked out here is that they want to have 100% responsibly sourced apparel fabrics by the year 2025. And they define this as fabrics that are made with recycled, regenerative, or responsibly sourced renewable fabrics. Okay, so they're aware that a lot of synthetic fabrics right now come from oil, and they are trying to move away from that by the year 2025 for apparel and for footwear and other equipment by 2030. On a similar note, they're looking to accelerate their use of sustainable packaging. So trying to get away from single-use plastic packaging and using more recycled content and that sort of thing. So, okay, this is great. They are acknowledging that they're still using a lot of petroleum-based products for their own apparel and footwear and other stuff in their packaging. And they realize they need to move away, but they have not done so yet because it's difficult. Now, here's what happened back in, this was several years ago. So a company called Innovex, which is an oil field service company based out of Houston, Innovex Downhole Solutions, they wanted the North Face to make them some company branded fleece pullovers, I think it was, for as a Christmas present to their employees. And so they sent the request to the North Face, and the North Face said, well, thanks, but no thanks. Since you guys are in the oil and gas industry, we don't really approve of what you do. And so, maybe you can find someone else to make your company branded fleeces. And the CEO of Innovex sent back this letter to to the north face, which raises some fair points. At the beginning here, this is something I touched on in my previous two lectures, which is that oil and gas use over the last 250 years has been correlated with significant improvements in quality of life. And say what you want about carbon emissions and climate change and all those issues, but it's a fair point that we can't just sweep under the carpet here. And so he says the irony in the statement is your jackets are made from the oil and gas products that the hardworking men and women of our industry produce. Without oil and gas, there would be no market for nor ability to create the products your company sells. Okay, yeah, well, so this really highlights the complexities that we're dealing with in these issues. Just to use petroleum products as an example, they're so entwined in our lives. I am delivering this lecture and recording it on a computer that is mostly made out of plastic. Sitting in a chair that's mostly made out of plastic. I mean, it's very hard to get away from this stuff. And so we really need to think carefully about what exactly it is we want to accomplish with the energy transition. We cannot ignore the effect that it'll have on global supply chains. Look at what's happening right now. So I'm recording this in April of 2022. The United States is exporting every last molecule of liquefied natural gas that it possibly can to Europe to make up for energy shortcomings as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine. That has caused natural gas prices here to increase significantly over the past few weeks. Natural gas prices were already high in Europe before the invasion. Now they're extremely high. So thinking about just moving energy around and changing energy sources, this could be have considerable disruption to the global economy. How can we also I'll just put this out there, how can we continue to rely on hydrocarbon sourced products when a lot of companies and governments are making these net zero by 2050, net zero by 2075 type commitments? Is this going to require us to completely abandon oil and gas? I mean, I don't think we're going to be able to. So we really have to think about, how we're going to proceed. I mentioned the energy prices in Europe. So even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was an unfolding energy crisis going on in Europe in terms of gas prices. So this is natural gas prices in Europe. This is in euros per megawatt hour on the y-axis. And the x-axis here is just looking at 2018, 2019, 2020, and then you can see a huge increase here at the end of 2021 going into 2022. And so, this has a lot of different causes, depending on whom you ask. Some people will point to various things over others, but there's really a number of reasons this was the case. So Europe had a colder than normal winter. It was, colder and wetter, so there was more demand. There was reduction in natural gas supplies for a variety of different reasons. It wasn't as windy as it normally is. So wind production was down for the whole year, actually. A lot of countries are phasing out coal-powered power plants and nuclear power plants in a deliberate way. Some of this is still an ongoing reaction to the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, and then phasing out coal just for climate-related reasons. Although I think we're starting to see some of that slow down, particularly in Germany now with the geopolitical issues going on. COVID cannot be ignored. There's just been less ability to maintain oil and gas infrastructure because of workforce issues associated with COVID. We see that here in the United States also. And overall, European gas production has been declining over the past few years. So can we directly pin this on a transition to renewables? Well, possibly. So like I said, the reduction in coal and nuclear power is deliberate. And the decrease in gas production is also policy driven. But is it completely due to the transition to renewables? I mean, no, I don't think so. You have to look at some of these other factors as well. But you have to ask yourself, will crises like this be a feature of the ongoing energy transition? And if so, what can be done to mitigate them and do this transition in a responsible and sustainable fashion? So we're going to close out by looking at, if we do have an energy transition, what is it really going to look like? So here's a nice graph from Carrie King's book looking at world energy consumption by source since 1800. So what you can see is that as we move forward in time, there are a number of these energy transitions. So first, coal replaced biomass, and then oil replaced coal, and then gas took some of the share away from oil. But what's common among these different transitions is that we are adding more types of energy sources to the mix rather than eliminating them, okay? Kind of at the expense of biomass. But for the rest of these, we're just adding more sources. And the future energy transition to lower carbon energy is that, a lot of sectors, people are expecting low carbon energy sources to replace higher carbon ones. So, maybe we'll just completely replace coal. Well, is this doable? Do we have enough energy production to be able to get rid of energy sources? So think about that. What are the technology solutions we need to be able to do that? Is there enough capacity? And, we're still going to have this issue I talked about earlier, which is we get a lot of other stuff from petroleum, including, plastics, carbon fiber, which is used to make, airplanes, that sort of thing, that comes from oil. So what are we going to do about those products? I don't think it's right that we can just say, oh, let's completely get rid of that, those sources from petroleum products. It's going to have to be done in a different way. Now, let's finish up here with some a couple of figures from sustainable energy without the hot air. So who's going to be responsible for driving the sustainable energy transition? Okay, so if you look at world greenhouse gas emissions, they're about 34 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. And that comes out to a little over 5 tons equivalent per year per person. So this is averaged across the entire globe. One thing I want to point out is that McKay's book was published in 2009. So that's the figures I'm using here. That's why the world population is only 6 billion. That's a lot more than that now. Well, when we can break this out by different regions of the world. So keep in mind that 5 tons per person, that I believe that giga there is a misprint, 5 tons per person per year. So that's that line there. You can see that a lot of parts of the world are way over that. So, North America, Oceania, and Europe, we're, emitting a lot more CO2 per person than, say, Asia or sub-Saharan Africa, which, those make up a lot more population, but they're emitting less, less CO2 than we are. Now we can, break this down further and look at this on a country by country basis. So, the US is a high emitter of greenhouse gases. That shouldn't be a surprise, but we are joined by Australia. Certain countries in the Middle East are very large emitters. A lot of this has to do just with the sheer amount of oil and gas that they produce. And even within different regions, South Africa is far above the global average here. As are, some places like Japan, Uzbekistan, Venezuela. So it, can be broken down in a very granular fashion. So should the countries that are the biggest emitters right now be responsible for this? Or think about, cumulative emissions over the period 1880 to 2004. Here's where the US and the United Kingdom and Germany really dominate. And this has to do with the fact that, the use of coal and the Industrial Revolution goes back a lot farther in these countries than it does in some other places like Brazil, for instance, or China. So, it's probably, the right thing to do for those of us who have emitted the most emissions to think about trying to rectify this situation. We have to do this responsibly, though. Like I said earlier, you can't just go to a developing country and say, hey, y'all can't, start using energy the way we do because we actually realized it's bad, okay? There's actually really low-hanging fruit you can do. Like in developing countries, people are still cooking with kerosene, wood, charcoal, or, various types of waste. So even just moving them to natural gas would improve quality of life through indoor air quality improvements and efficiency, right? Another thing you have to think about is there's a lot of countries that rely on oil and gas for significant amounts of their GDP. Nigeria, 200 million people in Africa. Oil and gas exports are 70% of its budget, 40% of its GDP. You should also think about places like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, places that produce a lot of oil, and really their economies rely on this. Here's a nice quote from the energy minister of Senegal from McKay's book. Restricting lending for oil and gas development is like removing the ladder and asking us to jump or fly. These countries also deserve to, increase their energy consumption, improve their quality of life. And so we need really to think about what's the best way of doing that. Okay, so looking ahead, we're going to need new technologies to meet energy demand and improve sustainability. And this really requires having smart scientists and engineers. And I hope that's what we're going to be producing in the future. I know it is. But we also have to understand that whatever technology solutions we come up with, they don't exist in a vacuum, right? There are social, economic, and policy implications that we do need to be aware of. And, again, this isn't an economics or policy class or, sociology class. But we always need to keep these things in mind because this is a global solution that has to do with people. And so we have to be people focused here. So that brings us to the end of our unit on defining sustainability. So in my next lecture, I'm going to start talking about carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We'll start off with a lecture on the carbon cycle, and then go into some of the carbon capture technologies. So I hope you come back for that one, and thanks for watching this.